There was a time, long before the dust claimed these valleys, when light fell differently upon the world. Not the harsh light of noon that burns the eyes and scalds the stone, but something softer, something that seemed to emanate from within the very earth itself. They called it Okran's light, and beneath its gentle glow, a nation was born. Picture, if you will, a morning thousands of years ago, the sun rising over mountains whose names have been forgotten. In the valleys below, simple people tending to simple lives. Farmers turning soil that had never known the plow. Shepherds guiding their flocks through meadows of silver grass. And in the distance, always in the distance, the shimmer of something that looked like heat but felt like hope. The holy nation did not begin with grand declarations or conquest. It began with a candle. A single flame cupped in the hands of a wanderer who would come to be known as the Phoenix King, though that title would arrive much later, carried on the whispers of the faithful like seeds on the wind. For now, in this early dawn of history, he was simply a traveler, a man with sun-darkened skin and eyes that had seen too many horizons. He carried nothing but a pack, a worn cloak the color of sandstone, and that candle, always burning, never dimming even in the strongest gale. The people who first encountered him spoke of how he walked, not with the urgency of a merchant or the caution of a soldier, but with the unhurried pace of someone who knew that every step was part of a longer journey. He would stop in villages, settlements barely worthy of the name, clusters of mud brick homes huddled together against the emptiness of the plains, and he would sit. He would sit in doorways and beneath the shade of whatever sparse trees grew in that harsh landscape, and he would speak. Not sermons, not commandments carved into stone tablets or proclaimed from mountaintops, just stories. He told of a time before the dust, when the world was young and malleable as clay, when spirits walked openly among mortals, neither fully flesh nor dream, but something in between. He spoke of how the first people learned to shape fire, not by stealing it from the gods, but by understanding that fire was always within them, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be tended. Every soul, he would say, his voice low and textured like old parchment, is a wick waiting for the spark. And once lit, it has a choice: to burn bright and brief, consuming everything in its hunger, or to burn steady and long, offering warmth to those who gather near. The candle in his hands never wavered. People began to follow him, not in the fervent way that armies follow warlords or pilgrims follow prophets, but quietly. A farmer would finish his day's work, wash the dirt from his hands, and find himself walking in the direction the wanderer had gone. A weaver would set aside her loom and pack a small bag, feeling drawn by something she couldn't name. A child would tug at her mother's sleeve, pointing toward the horizon where a small flame flickered in the gathering dusk. Years passed this way. seasons turning like pages in a book written in a language only the land understood. The wanderer's hair grew long and began to silver at the temples. Lines deepened around his eyes from squinting at distant things, but the candle never aged. It burned with the same steady persistence, day after day, night after night. The first temple was not built by decree. It simply happened. In a village called Ashholm, now lost beneath centuries of sand, the people noticed that the wanderer returned to the same spot each year. A clearing at the edge of town, where a natural spring bubbled up between smooth stones. The water was sweet and cold, even in the height of summer. Trees grew there, their leaves a pale green that seemed to glow in the evening light. And each time the wanderer arrived, he would sit beside the spring, plant his candle in the soft earth, and remain there for 7 days and 7 nights. On the first night, he would speak of beginnings. On the second, of growth. On the third, of struggle. On the fourth, of wisdom gained through failure. On the fifth, of love in its many forms. On the sixth, of the beauty in letting go. And on the 7th night, he would speak of nothing at all. He would simply sit in silence, watching the candle flame dance and flicker, while those gathered around him found their own stillness. After enough years of this pilgrimage, the villagers decided to honor the spot. They brought stones from the river, each one carefully chosen and carried. They laid them in a circle around the spring, creating a low wall that marked the space as sacred. They planted more trees, varieties that bloomed in different seasons, so there would be always some color, some life, no matter when travelers arrived. And slowly, reverently, they began to call the wanderer a new name. Okran. It meant the one who tends the flame in their old tongue, a language that would evolve and shift over centuries until even this origin was forgotten. But the name stuck. It felt right in their mouths, familiar as a prayer they'd been saying all their lives without knowing the words. Okran accepted the name with the same quiet grace he accepted everything. He neither encouraged worship nor discouraged it. He simply continued his pattern, walking the land, lighting candles in dark places, sitting with those who sought his presence. And in his wake, more temples grew. Not temples of stone and stained glass, not yet. Those would come later when the faith had calcified into something more rigid, more organized. These temples were humble things. Circles of stones around natural features, springs, ancient trees, outcroppings of rock that caught the light just so at dawn or dusk. Each one marked a place where Okran had rested, where his candle had burned through a night of stories. And each one became a gathering place. People would travel from distant villages to sit in these circles. They would bring their own candles, purchasing them from craftsmen who had learned to make wicks that burned slowly, steadily, using wax infused with herbs that produced a gentle, pleasant smoke, lavender and sage, and something else, something that no one could quite identify, but that seemed to ease the mind and slow the breath. They would light their candles from Okran's eternal flame, carrying the fire from temple to temple like a relay of light across the darkening world. And they would sit together, strangers bound by something deeper than blood or language. They would sit and speak of their lives, their fears, their small joys, the grief they carried like stones in their pockets, the dreams that visited them in sleep, mysterious and meaningful. There were no priests yet, no hierarchy, no sacred texts or dogma, just people, sharing firelight and stories, finding in that simple act something they hadn't known they were missing. The holy nation grew from these gatherings the way a tree grows from a seed, slowly, organically, without anyone quite noticing when it became something larger than itself. Villages that held these temples began to prosper, whether through the power of the light itself or simply because people who gathered in peace tended to treat each other with more kindness. It was hard to say, but the fields seemed more fertile, the flocks more healthy, the winters less harsh, and travelers spoke of how, when approaching these villages from a distance, they could see something shimmer in the air above them, like heat, but cooler, like starlight, but warmer. Other settlements took notice. They sent emissaries to learn the ways of the candle tenders. They asked for teachers to come and show them how to create their own temples, how to maintain the flame, how to sit in that particular way that seemed to open something inside the chest, some inner door that had been locked tight against the cold world. And Okran, growing older now, his hair fully white, his movements slower but no less graceful, began to train others to carry on his work. He chose carefully, not the loudest voices or the most charismatic, not the wealthy or the powerful. He looked for something else, a quality of attention, perhaps, a willingness to listen more than speak. People who could sit with another's pain without trying to fix it, who could witness another's joy without diminishing it with envy. These became the first true priests of Okran's light. Though they did not call themselves priests, they called themselves keepers, keepers of the flame, keepers of the stories, keepers of the silence that held everything together like mortar between stones. The keepers traveled as Okran had traveled, on foot, with simple packs and simpler needs. They established new temples in wild places, following some internal compass that pointed toward springs hidden in deep forests, or clearings atop mesas where the wind spoke in 100 different voices. They carried with them small lanterns, each containing a flame taken from Okran's original candle, and with these they lit new fires that would burn for generations. And still, the holy nation was not yet a nation. It had no borders, no armies, no kings or laws or taxation. It was simply a network of light, points of flame scattered across the map, connected by the paths of pilgrims and keepers, by the stories they told and the silence
they shared.
But things that grow must eventually take form. It happened gradually, as all true transformations do. Villages near the temples began to organize around them. They built better roads to accommodate the increasing number of pilgrims. They established inns and way stations where travelers could rest. They developed systems for maintaining the temple grounds, for producing the special candles, for training new keepers. With organization came structure. With structure came hierarchy. The keepers, who had once been wanderers, found themselves administrators. They needed to coordinate the production of candles, ensure the purity of the wax and the quality of the wicks. They needed to settle disputes between villages over temple maintenance, over who had the right to host certain ceremonies, over the proper interpretation of Okran's teachings. Teachings which, it should be noted, Okran himself had never codified. He had only told stories. But stories, when repeated often enough, become scriptures. And scriptures, when studied long enough, become law. The first written texts appeared about 100 years after Okran's original journeys. Scribes began collecting the stories that elders remembered, trying to preserve them before they faded from living memory. But memory is a strange thing. It shifts and colors and embellishes. 10 people remembering the same story will remember 10 different versions, each true in its own way, each altered by the lens of personal experience. The scribes tried to reconcile these differences. They compared versions, debated nuances, attempted to extract some essential truth that ran beneath all the variations. And in doing so, they created something new. Not Okran's actual words, but a consensus about what Okran's words must have meant. A distillation, a crystallization. These texts were copied and distributed to all the major temples. They were studied, memorized, and chanted in the flickering candlelight. They became the foundation of what would eventually be called the doctrine of light. And with doctrine came inevitability, the question of orthodoxy. Because once you have a sacred text, you must also have those who interpret it correctly and those who interpret it incorrectly. You must have those who are truly faithful and those who are merely pretending. You must draw lines. You must define what it means to be part of the community of light and what it means to stand outside it. Borders were drawn, not with walls or armies, but with temples. The land was divided into provinces, each centered around a major temple complex. The keepers became a formal priesthood with ranks and titles and specific areas of responsibility. Novices studied for years before they were allowed to tend a flame on their own. Masters of the light supervised entire provinces, ensuring doctrinal consistency and proper ritual. And at the center of it all, in the largest temple yet built, in a city that had grown from a humble village into a sprawling metropolis of sandstone and light, they placed Okran's original candle. The Phoenix King, as he was now universally known, had passed from the world long ago. Some said he simply walked into the desert one dawn and never returned. Others claimed he'd transformed into pure light, merging with the flame he had carried for so long. Still others whispered that he was not gone at all, but sleeping in a hidden temple deep beneath the earth, waiting for the time when the world would need his light again. But his candle remained, burning in a chamber of polished stone, tended day and night by the highest priests of the order. Pilgrims traveled from across the nation just to stand in its presence for a few precious moments, to feel the warmth of that original flame, to pray for guidance or healing, or simply to experience the peace that seemed to radiate from it like waves of invisible force. The city around the temple grew vast. They called it Ember, and it became the heart of everything, the capital of the holy nation, the center from which light spread to all the provinces and territories and lands beyond. Roads like arteries carried pilgrims and merchants and knowledge. Aqueducts brought water from distant mountains. Farms in the surrounding valleys produced grain and fruit and vegetables enough to feed a population that swelled with each passing year. Craftsmen perfected their arts, creating candles of such purity and beauty that they were considered sacred objects in themselves. Scholars established libraries where the texts of the doctrine were studied alongside philosophies from other lands, seeking to understand Okran's wisdom in ever deeper contexts. It was a golden age, the kind that historians write about with longing centuries after it ends, the kind that seems, in retrospect, almost too perfect to have been real. Children grew up knowing nothing but peace and plenty. Elders spoke of how fortunate they were, how blessed by Okran's light. Poets composed verses about the eternal flame and the eternal nation it had birthed. And the light itself seemed to grow stronger. Travelers approaching Ember from miles away reported seeing a glow on the horizon, as if the sun were rising in the wrong direction. At night, the city blazed like a constellation fallen to earth. Every window and doorway flickering with candles, every street illuminated by lanterns hanging from poles and archways. It was beautiful. It was glorious. It was everything the faithful had dreamed of and worked toward for generations. And like all beautiful things, it contained within itself the seeds of its own ending. But that is a thought for later. For now, in this moment between sleep and waking, let us hold the image of the holy nation at its height. Let us see the candles burning in their thousands, each flame a prayer, each light a life. Breathe slowly. Feel the warmth of those distant flames. Imagine the smell of wax and herbs, the soft murmur of evening prayers, the way shadows danced on ancient walls. The holy nation rose like dawn, bright and full of promise. Rest now in the memory of that light.
The wind changes. Listen closely to what it carries. In the beginning, the cracks were so small that no one noticed them. Hairline fractures in the foundation, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look and why looking mattered. The holy nation continued its daily rhythms, times, its prayers and markets and festivals, while deep beneath the surface, something shifted. It began, as these things often do, with a question. In the great library of Ember, where the oldest texts were kept in climate-controlled chambers and handled only by senior scholars with clean hands and reverent hearts, a young priest named Senna was given a particular assignment by her mentor to compare 3 different versions of a story called The Parable of the 2 Flames. It was a well-known teaching, one that every novice learned in their first year of study. The story told of 2 people who each lit a candle. One burned their candle constantly, keeping it with them at all times, never letting it go out. The other lit their candle only at specific moments for specific purposes and extinguished it when the need had passed. The moral, as it was commonly taught, was clear. Faith must be constant, not conditional. The light of Okran should burn always in the hearts of the faithful, not flickering on and off as convenience dictates. But as Senna compared the 3 manuscripts, she noticed something strange. In the oldest version, the one dated closest to Okran's actual lifetime, the story ended differently. Both people, it seemed, had been praised by the Phoenix King, the one who burned constantly for their dedication, the one who burned sparingly for their wisdom. And Okran had said something that wasn't in any of the later versions. A flame that burns without rest will consume its fuel and die. A flame that knows when to rest will burn longer than empires. Senna sat back in her chair, the ancient parchment before her suddenly feeling heavier than it should. She read the passage again, then again, checking her translation, making sure she hadn't misunderstood the archaic script. But no, there it was, clear as starlight. The teaching had changed. Somewhere in the centuries of copying and recopying, of interpreting and reinterpreting, the ending had been altered. The nuance had been smoothed away. The paradox had been resolved into something simpler, cleaner, more doctrinally convenient.
She brought her findings to her mentor, a woman named Kyle, who had spent 40 years studying the texts. Kyle examined the manuscripts with the careful attention of someone reading a loved one's final letter. She checked the dating, the handwriting, the linguistic markers that indicated different eras of composition. Finally, she nodded slowly. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The story has changed. Should we tell someone? Shouldn't the doctrine be corrected?" Kyle was quiet for a long time. Outside the library windows, the eternal sunset of ember painted the sky in shades of orange and rose. Candles were being lit throughout the city, as they were lit every evening, in a ritual as automatic as breathing. "Who would we tell?" Kyle asked finally. "The High Keepers? The Council of Light? Do you think they would welcome this information? That they would rush to revise every copy of the doctrine? To retrain every priest? To inform every faithful citizen that we've been teaching the parable of two flames incorrectly for 200 years? Senna felt something cold settle in her stomach. But truth matters, doesn't it? Isn't that the whole point? To understand Okran's actual teachings, not what we've decided he must have meant? You would think so. Kyle's smile was sad. But institutions are not built on questions, child. They are built on certainty, on clear answers and unambiguous rules. The moment you introduce doubt, you introduce instability. And instability. She gestured toward the window, toward the glowing city beyond. Instability threatens all of this. The conversation stayed with Senna. It nested in her thoughts like a bird building a home in the rafters, impossible to dislodge. She began looking at other texts with new eyes, comparing versions, noting discrepancies, finding more places where the teachings had evolved, where Okran's original words had been shaped and reshaped by the hands of people who claimed only to be preserving them. And she was not the only one noticing. In the provinces, away from Ember's magnificent light, other priests and priestesses were having their own quiet realizations, small moments of doubt that they confessed to no one, or confessed only to trusted friends in whispered conversations after evening prayers. Father Micah, who tended a temple in the northern hills, had begun to wonder about the emphasis on poverty. The doctrine taught that excessive wealth corrupted the soul, that the faithful should live simply, giving their surplus to the temples and the poor. This made sense to Micah. It aligned with Okran's own humble lifestyle. But he couldn't help noticing that this teaching was enforced very differently depending on who you were. Common farmers and craftspeople were expected to give until it hurt, to demonstrate their devotion through sacrifice. But the high priests, the Council of Light, they lived in luxury. Their robes were finest linen. Their chambers were appointed with art and furniture that cost more than most families earned in a lifetime. They ate delicacies while preaching restraint. They accumulated wealth in the temple's coffers while sermonizing about the spiritual dangers of material attachment. When Micah mentioned this discrepancy to his superior, he was told he was being naive. The High Keepers need resources to do their work, the superior explained patiently. They are responsible for the entire nation. They need meeting halls and libraries and infrastructure. You cannot compare their situation to that of a simple farmer. I'm not comparing. I'm just wondering if maybe Okran's teaching about simplicity was meant for everyone, not just the powerless. His superior's face hardened. Be careful with that line of thinking, Father. It leads nowhere good. But the thought, once planted, couldn't be uprooted. In the eastern provinces, a priestess named Zara was struggling with different questions. She ran an orphanage, a place where children who had lost their families could find shelter and care. The work was hard but meaningful. She loved these children, She devoted herself to them with the same fervor others devoted to prayer and study. But according to the doctrine, this was insufficient. Zara had never married, had never borne children of her own, and in the holy nation's increasingly rigid interpretation of proper faith, this was seen as a failure. Women were meant to be mothers, the teaching said. They were vessels of life, carriers of the next generation of faithful. A woman who chose not to marry, who chose to dedicate herself to other pursuits, was deviating from Okran's plan. Never mind that Okran himself had never married. Never mind that the Phoenix King had traveled alone, had no children, and had devoted himself entirely to his spiritual work. That was different, apparently. He was the Phoenix King. The rules that applied to him did not apply to ordinary believers. Zara felt the pressure constantly. Comments from other priests, questions from temple elders, the way women in her village looked at her with pity or disapproval, as if raising 24 orphans was somehow less meaningful than bearing 1 or 2 of her own. She prayed about it. Long nights kneeling before her small altar, candle burning low, asking Okran for guidance. But no guidance came. Only the creeping sense that something in the doctrine wasn't quite right, that the faith she loved had been twisted into something that didn't fit the shape of actual human lives. These fractures multiplied, silent, private, each priest and priestess wrestling with their own doubts, thinking themselves alone in their questioning. But doubt has a way of finding company. It started at the annual gathering of keepers, a week-long event where priests from across the nation congregated in Ember to share knowledge, discuss theological matters, and renew their dedication to the light. Officially, it was a celebration. Unofficially, it was where information spread, where isolated priests discovered that others shared their concerns, where private bouts became, if not public, at least acknowledged among trusted circles. In quiet corners of the great temple, in gardens after dark, in rooms rented at inns away from official oversight, priests talked. Senna met Father Micah at one such gathering. She was introduced by Kyle, who had quietly been compiling a list of like-minded scholars and clergy, people who valued truth over tradition, who were willing to ask difficult questions even when the answers might be uncomfortable. I found something in the old texts about the parable of 2 flames, Senna told Micah over wine in a small tavern. And I found something in our current practice about who gets to be wealthy and who has to be poor. They talked for hours, comparing notes, finding patterns, realizing that the inconsistencies they each had noticed were part of something larger, a systematic drift away from Okran's original teachings towards something more, convenient, more politically useful, more suited to maintaining power and control.
Priestess Zara joined their conversation the next day. Then Brother Thomas, who had questions about the doctrine's teachings on violence. Then Sister Ilara, who wondered why women had been gradually excluded from higher positions of authority when the earliest records showed them serving as keepers alongside men. By the end of the gathering, there were perhaps 20 priests who had shared their concerns with each other. 20 out of thousands, a tiny fraction, but 20 candles, when placed together, give more light than one. They made no dramatic declarations, They formed no rebel movement. They simply agreed to stay in contact, to continue studying, to share what they learned, to ask questions gently within their own communities, and to watch, to see if the fractures they noticed were isolated cracks or the beginning of something larger. The answer came more quickly than any of them expected. In the southern province of Ashkar, a high keeper named Solon had been preaching a particularly rigid interpretation of the doctrine. He had declared that any art that did not directly glorify Okran was sinful. Music, paintings, sculptures, poetry, all of it must serve the faith or be destroyed. This was not, strictly speaking, supported by the doctrine. Okran had loved beauty in all its forms. He had praised musicians and dancers, had sat with painters watching them work, had encouraged people to find the divine in sunsets and birdsong and the laughter of children. But Solon had convinced himself and many others that these were distractions, temptations, lures away from proper devotion. He began burning books, not heretical texts or forbidden knowledge, but poetry, novels, collections of folk tales, anything that wasn't explicitly religious. He shut down theaters and music halls. He ordered the whitewashing of murals in public squares, replacing them with simple texts from the doctrine. The people of Ashkar obeyed, not because they agreed, but because Solon was the high keeper. To disobey him was to disobey Okran, or so they had been taught. And to disobey Okran was to risk everything: your place in the community, your family's safety, your hope for whatever came after death. But resentment built, quietly, invisibly, like water behind a dam. A young woman named Kira, a musician who had played the lute since childhood, watched as her instrument was taken from her home and thrown onto a bonfire in the town square. She stood in the crowd, face blank, while flames consumed the wood her grandfather had carved, the strings her mother had taught her to tune. That night, she left Ashkar. She walked north, away from Solon's province, away from the holy nation entirely. She was not the first. She would not be the last. People began to leave. Not in great waves, not in obvious exodus, but steadily. Families relocating to border provinces, young people setting out on pilgrimages and never returning, merchants whose trade routes took them beyond the nation's boundaries, deciding to settle elsewhere. The Council of Light noticed. How could they not? Tax revenues dropped. Temple attendance declined. Entire villages on the periphery emptied out, becoming ghost towns where candles burned in empty windows, tended by automated mechanisms because no human remained to do the work. The council's response was to tighten control. They issued new edicts, new regulations. Attendance at weekly services became mandatory, with fines for those who missed without proper excuse. The study of any text not approved by the council was forbidden. Travel beyond the nation's borders required permits, which were granted only for specific business purposes and limited durations. Each new rule was justified as protecting the faithful, keeping them safe from corrupting influences, preserving the purity of Okran's light in a world growing darker. But to those already questioning, each new rule felt like confirmation, like proof that the institution had lost its way, that power, not enlightenment, had become the goal. that the holy nation's leaders were more concerned with maintaining their authority than with actually following Okran's teachings. The fractures spread. In the western provinces, a group of priests began holding services according to what they called the old way. No elaborate ceremonies, no hierarchical seating, no expensive vestments, just people sitting in circles, lighting candles, sharing stories. The way Okran himself had done centuries ago before the faith became an empire. The council declared these gatherings heretical. They sent enforcers, priests trained in combat, which itself was a disturbing development, to break up the meetings and arrest the ringleaders. But you cannot arrest an idea once it has taken root. You cannot intimidate doubt into silence. You can only drive it underground, where it grows in darkness, feeding on exactly the kind of authoritarian overreach that confirms its worst suspicions. Priests who had been loyal for decades began to question. If the council was willing to use violence to suppress different interpretations of Okran's teachings, then perhaps the council itself had forgotten what those teachings were. If the institution needed force to maintain unity, then unity was already lost. And an ember, in the heart of the holy nation, in the great temple where Okran's original candle burned eternal, the flame flickered, just once, just for a moment. So brief that the priests tending it convinced themselves they had imagined it, a trick of the light, or fatigue, or the wind from a distant door opening. But deep down, in the parts of themselves they tried not to examine too closely, they knew what they had seen, and they were afraid.
The night deepens. Settle into the darkness and listen to what stirs beyond the light. There were places where light ends and shadow begins, and the borders of the holy nation had always been such places. Not sharp lines drawn on maps, but gradual transitions. Zones where the glow from temple candles faded into the uncertain darkness of the wild lands beyond, where faith thinned like air at high altitude, harder to breathe, harder to sustain. Picture these borderlands in your mind's eye, rolling hills that gave way to rocky badlands, forests that grew denser and darker the farther you traveled from the temple roads, villages that were half inside the nation's light and half outside it, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The people who lived in these liminal spaces had always been different from those in the heartland. Harder, perhaps, more practical. They knew that faith alone did not keep the wolves away from the sheep, that prayer did not fill empty bellies when the harvest failed. They believed in Okran, yes, but they also believed in strong walls and sharp blades and knowing when to run. For centuries this had worked. The borderlands served as a buffer, a gradual transition between the holy nation's ordered light and the chaos of the world beyond. The people there paid their taxes, attended their services, raised their children in the faith. They were loyal in their way, loyal enough. But loyalty is a thing that requires tending, like a flame. And as the holy nation turned inward, consumed by its internal fractures and doctrinal disputes, the borders were forgotten. Not deliberately, not all at once, but slowly, the way one forgets to water a plant until the leaves begin to yellow and curl. Temple funds that once maintained border fortifications were redirected to building grander churches in ember. Priests who might have served in frontier villages were kept in the capital, needed for the increasingly complex bureaucracy of faith. Caravans that brought supplies and news became less frequent, then rare, then stopped coming at all. The border communities began to feel what abandonment tastes like, bitter, like metal on the tongue. In a village called Thornwatch, perched on the edge of the eastern wilderness, a woman named Mara stood watch on the wooden palisade her community had built with their own hands. No help from the holy nation. No priests had come to bless the construction. No resources allocated from the central temples. Just villagers with axes and rope and the stubborn determination of people who know they stand alone. Below, in the gathering dusk, the forest moved. Not with wind, with purpose. Mara had seen enough beasts in her 30 years to recognize the signs. The unnatural stillness of birds, the way shadows seemed to pool in certain places, darker than they should be. The smell that preceded them, like rotting meat and wet fur and something else, something wrong at a fundamental level. She rang the bell. 3 sharp peals that echoed across the village square, the signal everyone knew, the one they had hoped never to hear again so soon after the last attack. People moved with practiced efficiency. Children were ushered into the central longhouse, its walls reinforced with whatever scraps of metal the blacksmith could spare. Livestock were driven into pens near the town center. Men and women alike took up positions along the palisade, holding whatever weapons they possessed. Hunting bows, farming implements sharpened to points, a few actual swords, old heirlooms from ancestors who had served in the holy nation's long-ago wars. The beasts came with the full dark. They always did. No one knew what they truly were. The priests in distant Ember called them demons, manifestations of spiritual corruption, proof that the world beyond Okran's light was poisoned and damned. But the people of Thornwatch knew them as something more mundane and somehow more terrible. Animals, or things that had once been animals, twisted by something in the deep wilderness. Hunger given form, survival instinct stripped of all conscience or mercy. They were large, these creatures, 4-legged but with joints that bent wrong, that allowed them to move in ways that hurt to watch.
Their fur was matted with substances that might have been sap, or might have been blood, or might have been something with no name. Their eyes reflected torchlight with an intelligence that was almost human, almost enough to let you hope they could be reasoned with, but not quite. Never quite. The attack, when it came, was not the sudden violence of story and legend. It was slow, testing. The beasts circled the palisade, probing for weaknesses, learning the rhythm of the defenders' movements. One would dart forward, drawing arrows and attention, while others watched from the shadows, calculating. Hours passed this way. The moon rose, nearly full, turning the world silver and black. Torches burned low and were replaced. Children cried in the longhouse until exhaustion claimed them and they slept in their mother's arms. The beasts continued their patient siege. Mara's arms ached from holding her bow at ready. Her eyes burned from straining to track movement in the darkness. Beside her, old Garrett muttered prayers under his breath, the words of Okran that they had all learned as children about light overcoming darkness, about faith providing protection. But faith, Mara had learned, needed to be backed by strong walls and sharp arrows. And even then, sometimes it was not enough. The beasts withdrew before dawn, melting back into the forest like fog under sun. They took with them 2 goats that had panicked and broken through their pen, and the body of young Marcus, who had fallen from the palisade during the night, his neck broken in the dark. A stupid death, a preventable death, the kind that haunts more than any beast could. In the gray light of morning, the village buried Marcus in their small cemetery, where carved stones marked the places where others had been laid to rest after similar nights.
The priest who should have conducted the ceremony was not there, had not been there for 3 years, since the last one was recalled to the capital and never replaced. So Mara spoke the words herself, the best she could remember them, about light and rest and the hope of renewal, about Marcus's smile and his skill with wood carving and the way he always helped the elderly carry water from the well. The gathered villagers listened in silence. Then they returned to their work, repairing the section of palisade damaged during the night, tending to the injured, preparing for the next attack, which might come tomorrow or next week or next month, but would certainly come. This pattern repeated across the borderlands. Different villages, different nights, different beasts, but always the same abandonment. Always the same realization creeping in like cold water through boots. The holy nation no longer protected its edges. Perhaps it no longer could. Perhaps it no longer cared to try. And it was not only beasts that troubled the borders. In the northern reaches, where the land grew rocky and hard, where winter came early and stayed late, bandits had begun to organize. Not the small groups of desperate thieves that had always existed on the margins of society, but something larger, more structured, almost like an army.
They called themselves the Free Company, though free from what was a matter of interpretation. Free from law, free from faith, free from the obligations and restrictions that the holy nation imposed on those within its light. Their leader was a man named Rask, though whether that was his true name or one he had adopted, no one could say. He had been, according to rumor, a soldier once, one of the holy nation's enforcers, trained to protect the faith with steel when prayer proved insufficient. But something had broken in him, or perhaps broken free. Some story about a village he was ordered to purge for heresy, about women and children and flames, about orders followed and regrets that followed him afterward like hungry dogs. True or not, he now stood on the other side of that line between light and shadow, and he was not alone. The Free Company grew. Deserters from the holy nation's forces, people who had fled the increasingly authoritarian control of the council, those who had lost everything to the church's demands for tithes and taxes and demonstrations of faith, who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. They raided the border villages not with the mindless violence of beasts, but with purpose, taking food, yes, weapons, supplies, but also offering something in return, protection. Join us, they said. Renounce the church that has abandoned you. Keep your faith if you wish, but stop giving your resources to distant priests who do nothing for you. Stand with us, and we will stand with you. Some villages refused, held true to their oaths and their beliefs despite everything. They were usually left alive. Rask was pragmatic enough to know that martyrs served his enemies better than him, but stripped of anything useful, left with enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Other villages accepted, quietly at first, then with growing boldness. They stopped sending their tithes to Ember. They stopped flying the banners of the holy nation from their walls. They did not declare open rebellion, but they stopped pretending to be part of something that had already left them behind.
The Council of Light, when news of this finally reached them through their diminishing network of loyal priests and informants, responded with characteristic certainty and characteristic delay. They declared the Free Company heretics and outlaws. They promised military action, a crusade to cleanse the borders and restore proper order. But promises require resources to fulfill, and the holy nation's resources were stretched thin. The internal tensions, the doctrinal disputes, the need to maintain ever tighter control over the heartland, all of this consumed the energy and attention of those in power. A military campaign to the distant borders seemed less urgent than preventing the spread of dangerous ideas in Ember itself. So the promised crusade never came. The borderlands were left to fend for themselves, caught between the beasts in the wilderness and the bandits who claimed to protect them, loyal to a nation that increasingly existed only in name and memory. In Thornwatch, Mara stood watch again on the palisade. It had been 2 months since Marcus died. The beasts had attacked 3 more times. 6 more villagers were in the cemetery now, beneath stones carved with symbols of Okran that felt more like habit than hope. A figure approached from the forest. Not a beast, too purposeful, too upright. Not a traveler from within the holy nation. They came from the other direction, and they came less and less often these days. Mara nocked an arrow, but did not draw. Waiting, watching. The figure stepped into the clearing where the forest ended and the village's cleared lands began. A man, broad-shouldered, wearing leather armor patched and repatched. He carried no weapon in his hands, though a sword hung at his hip. He stopped at what he clearly judged to be the edge of arrow range and raised his empty hands. "Thornwatch," he called. His voice was strong, carrying easily across the distance. "I come to talk, not fight. My name is Rask." Murmurs ran along the palisade. Everyone knew the name. The heretic, the outlaw, the betrayer of oaths. And also the one who fought the beasts, the one who protected the villages that joined him, the one who might be the only reason some border communities still existed at all. Mara made a decision that she knew would define everything that followed. She called down to him, "Speak then, we're listening." What Rask said that day, standing alone in the clearing while the sun moved slowly across the sky, was not a sermon. He did not denounce Okran or the faith. He spoke instead of practicalities, of how the Free Company had driven the beasts from 3 valleys in the north, of food stores they could share, weapons they could provide, training they could offer, of a network of villages working together for mutual defense without need for distant priests or church bureaucracy. "Keep your faith," he said. "Keep your candles and your prayers. I ask you to stop giving your lives to an institution that has already given you up." The village debated long into the night. Some argued for loyalty to the holy nation, no matter how abandoned they felt. It was the right thing, the faithful thing. Others argued for survival. What good was faith if they were all dead? What good was loyalty to a nation that offered nothing in return? In the end, as dawn broke, Thornwatch made its choice. Not unanimously, not without pain, but they made it. They took down the holy nation's banner from above their gates. They sent a messenger to Rask with terms for alliance, and they began, slowly, quietly, to sever the ties that had bound them to the light of ember. They were not the first, they would not be the last. The borders of the holy nation contracted like a wound closing. Villages went silent, their monthly reports to the central temples ceasing without explanation. Trade routes that had functioned for centuries simply ended, merchants finding empty way stations where once there had been busy communities. And the maps in Ember's halls of governance, carefully maintained by scribes who had never seen the lands they illustrated, became increasingly fictional, marking territories as part of the nation long after they had drifted away.
noting villages that existed only as ruins, drawing borders that no longer meant anything to those who lived near them. And in those abandoned spaces, in those margins and shadows, something new was growing. Not yet organized enough to be called a nation of its own, not unified enough to challenge the holy nation openly, but no longer part of the light, no longer believing in the light, no longer waiting for the light to remember them. The beasts still hunted. The nights were still dangerous. But the people of the borderlands learned to face these dangers without the comfort of distant prayers. They learned to trust their walls more than their faith, their neighbors more than their priests, the strength of their own hands more than the promises of those who had never walked their lands or understood their struggles. And in clear nights, when the moon was bright and the beasts were quiet, if you stood in one of those border villages and looked towards Ember, towards the heart of the holy nation where the eternal flame burned, you could still see the glow on the horizon, still see the shimmer of that legendary light, but it seemed smaller than it used to, dimmer, like a candle burning in a vast and growing dark, like something that might, not yet too distant, simply flicker and go out. Rest now. Let the borders fade. Let the shadows soften into sleep.
Breathe slowly. Follow footsteps through dust. Walk with me through what remains. There is a particular quality to silence in abandoned places. Not the mere absence of sound, but something heavier, more present, as if the silence itself is a thing with weight and texture, pressing down on everything like morning fog that never lifts. This is the silence that greeted Elias as he walked the old pilgrim road toward Ember. He had been walking for 17 days, or was it 18? The count had become uncertain somewhere around the 10th day, when one dawn began to look exactly like the one before it and the one that would follow. The landscape here was all the same. Dust-colored stone, scrub brush clinging to life in the cracks. The road itself, once paved with carefully fitted stones, now broken and uneven, with plants pushing through wherever they could find purchase. Elias was old. Not ancient, but old enough that his joints protested each morning's rising, old enough that his beard had gone fully white, old enough to remember when this road had been crowded with pilgrims and merchants and priests moving between the temples, when you could walk from sunrise to sunset and always have another traveler in sight, when the road was never truly empty, never truly silent. Now he had seen no one for 6 days. The last travelers had been a family, mother, father, 3 children,
a cart loaded with everything they owned, moving away from Ember, not toward it. When Elias asked where they were going, the father had just shaken his head. "Anywhere else," he'd said. "Just anywhere that isn't here." They had offered to share their fire and their food that night, and Elias had accepted gratefully. His own supplies were running low. The way stations that should have dotted the road, offering shelter and provisions for travelers, stood empty, their wells often dry, their stores long since looted or rotted away. The children had stared at him with the solemn eyes of those who had seen too much uncertainty. The youngest, a girl no more than 5, had asked him, "Are you going to see Okran?" "I'm going to Ember, to the great temple." "Why?" It was a child's question, simple and direct, and Elias found he did not have a simple answer. Why was he walking toward a city he suspected was dying, toward a faith that might already be dead? What did he hope to find there? Finally, he said, "Because I need to see it, need to know, need to..." He trailed off. The father was watching him with understanding and pity in equal measure. "There's nothing left there to see," the father had said quietly when the children were asleep. "We came from a village 3 days north of Ember. The priests left 2 years ago. The temples stand empty. People stopped gathering for services. Some still pray, I suppose, in their homes. But the faith, the nation, it's finished. Surely you can see that." "I can see," Elias agreed. "But I still need to witness it, to walk the last steps, to know that I did not turn away before the end." The father had nodded slowly, as if this made a kind of sense that did not require agreement. They had parted ways in the morning, the family continuing their exodus, Elias continuing his pilgrimage to nowhere.
That had been 6 days ago. Now, as the sun reached its apex and the heat pressed down like a physical hand, Elias crested a low rise and saw in the distance what he had been walking toward all this time: Ember. The city sat in its valley like a jewel in a tarnished setting. Even from this distance, even through the haze of heat and dust, it was beautiful. The buildings rising in terraces, each level climbing toward the great temple at the center. The walls, once white stone that reflected the sun like snow, now weathered to gray but still standing, still encompassing everything within them. But no smoke rose from cooking fires. No banners flew from the walls. No sound carried across the valley. No shimmer of light on the horizon, that legendary glow that travelers had reported seeing from leagues away. Just stone. Just silence. Just stillness. Elias stood on the rise for a long time, looking at the city he had not seen in 40 years.
The city where he had trained as a young priest, where he had taken his vows, where he had believed with absolute certainty that Okran's light would burn forever and the holy nation would stand eternal. Then he descended into the valley, his walking stick tapping against the broken road, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the vast emptiness around him. The gates of Ember stood open, not broken open, not torn from their hinges by violence, just open. As if someone had unlocked them one morning and never bothered to close them again. The massive wooden doors, bound with iron and carved with scenes from Okran's legendary journey, hung still on their hinges. One had sagged somewhat over the years, its bottom edge scraping a groove in the stone threshold whenever the wind moved it. Elias passed through without ceremony. No guards challenged him. No one demanded his purpose or his credentials. He simply walked from the outside to the inside, crossing a boundary that had once meant everything, and now meant nothing at all. The outer district of the city looked almost normal at first glance. Buildings intact, streets cleanly swept by wind rather than human hands, but swept nonetheless. Windows shuttered, but not broken. It could have been a festival day, when everyone stayed inside for prayer and ceremony. But the details betrayed the truth. Doors hanging slightly ajar, gardens overgrown, their careful cultivation surrendered to the patient chaos of weeds and wild growth. A child's toy lying in the middle of a street, a wooden horse on wheels, bleached colorless by seasons of sun. And the silence. That impossible, complete silence. Elias walked deeper into the city, his footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. He tried to remember it as it had been, these streets crowded with people, merchants calling their wares, children running between the stalls of the market, the smell of bread baking, of incense from the temples, of humanity packed close and living loud. He found the market district by memory, the great square where vendors had gathered every day, where you could buy anything from farm vegetables to silk from distant lands, where the air had always hummed with haggling and gossip and the daily business of life. Now, the stall stood empty. Some had collapsed, their wooden frames rotted through. Others remained standing, as if still waiting for vendors who would never return. The fountain at the center of the square, fed by the aqueduct from the mountains, trickled weakly. The water in its basin was green with algae, its surface disturbed only by the occasional insect. Elias sat on the fountain's edge and rested. His feet ached. His water skin was nearly empty. He dipped it in the fountain, thought better of it, and left it empty. The water here might make him sick, might be his last drink. The thought did not trouble him as much as it should have. He closed his eyes and tried to remember a specific day, 40 years ago, when he had been young and certain. A market day when he had walked this very square with his mentor, an old priest named Okran, who had seemed impossibly wise and kind. They had stopped at a stall selling fruit, and Okran had bought a basket of small yellow plums. He had given half to Elias, and they had walked and eaten the fruit, the juice running down their chins, laughing at nothing in particular, just happy to be alive, to be part of something greater than themselves, to serve a faith that felt true and strong and necessary. "Promise me something," Okran had said, suddenly serious. Promise that if you ever stop believing, truly believing, in your heart, that you'll leave. Don't stay out of habit or fear. Don't become one of those priests who goes through the motions while feeling nothing. Better to be honestly uncertain than falsely certain. Elias had promised, confident that such a day would never come. How could he stop believing? The faith was self-evident, as obvious as the sun, as real as the stones beneath his feet. And yet here he was, walking through the ruins of everything he had once believed was eternal. He opened his eyes. The sun had moved while he sat lost in memory. Afternoon shadows stretched across the square. He needed to move, needed to complete what he had come here to do. The path to the great temple wound upward through the residential districts, climbing toward the city's heart. Elias walked it slowly, pausing often to rest and to observe, to bear witness. That was why he was here, to be the last pair of eyes to see these places, to carry the memory of what had been, even if there was no one left to tell. The houses here had been homes to the wealthy and powerful, large buildings with courtyards visible through open gates, gardens that had once been magnificent, now returning to wilderness but still beautiful in their dissolution. In one courtyard, a fountain still ran, fed by some undamaged section of the aqueduct, the water clean and clear. Elias drank deeply, filled his water skin, and silently thanked whoever had engineered these systems centuries ago, builders who had done their work so well that it outlasted the civilization it served. Higher still, into the districts where the priests had lived. Smaller dwellings, more modest but comfortable. Elias recognized the building where he had spent his years of training. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open and entered. The interior was dim, shutters closed against the sun. Dust lay thick on every surface. But the furniture remained. The simple beds, the desks where novices studied, the common room where they had gathered for evening discussions. Elias walked through the rooms like a ghost, visiting its own past. Here was the desk where he had sat and copied texts until his hand cramped. Here was the window where he had looked out at the stars and wondered about the nature of faith and certainty. Here was the doorway where he had stood the morning he took his vows, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, ready to devote his life to something bigger than himself. A lifetime ago, a different world, a person he barely recognized as himself anymore. He did not linger. There was nothing here for him but memories, and memories were both too heavy and too insubstantial to carry. The final ascent to the great temple was the hardest, not physically, though his legs protested every step, but emotionally, spiritually. This was the heart of everything, the place where Okran's original candle burned eternal, where the Phoenix King's legacy was preserved, where the faith lived in its purest, most concentrated form, or had lived.
The temple plaza opened before him, vast and empty, paved in white stone that had been quarried from distant mountains and transported here at enormous cost, each piece fitted so perfectly that you could barely see the seams. In the center of the plaza, rising above everything, the temple itself. It was beautiful even in abandonment. The architecture drew the eye upward, always upward, toward the dome that crowned the central chamber. Windows of colored glass, though many were broken now, gaps like missing teeth, that had once filled the interior with rainbow light. Columns carved with prayers and stories, the stone itself a scripture. The main doors stood open, had stood open, Elias suspected, for years. Wind had blown leaves and dust into the entrance hall, creating small drifts in the corners. He entered slowly, reverently, though he was not sure what he was being reverent toward. The building? The memory? The ghost of his own younger self who had believed this place was sacred? The entrance hall led to the sanctuary, a vast circular chamber beneath the dome. Benches arranged in concentric circles, all facing the center, where a raised platform held the shrine. And on the shrine, protected beneath a dome of glass, nothing. He stood, staring at the empty space where Okran's candle should have been. The pedestal remained, the glass dome remained, though cracked now, a spider web of fractures spreading from a single point of impact. But the candle itself was gone. Elias approached slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty chamber. Around the platform, the floor was scorched, black marks radiating outward, as if something had burned here with great intensity. And in the center, where the candle had stood, someone had left a note. Elias picked it up carefully. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for official documents. The writing was elegant, the hand of a trained scribe. It read, "To whoever finds this, the flame went out 3 years ago in the month of Ash. We tried everything to relight it. Fresh wicks, pure oils, prayers spoken continuously for days. Nothing worked. The High Council met in secret and debated what this meant. Some said it was a sign that we had failed, that our faith had become corrupted and unworthy. Others said it was a test, that Okran was teaching us not to depend on symbols, but to hold the light within ourselves. In the end, it didn't matter what it meant. The people found out. Word spread faster than we could contain it. The eternal flame had gone out. Okran's light had failed. Within a month, half the city was empty. Within 3, the council itself disbanded. The priests left for their home provinces, or left the faith entirely, or simply disappeared into the world beyond our borders. I stayed longest. I am the last, I think. The last keeper who still believed there was something worth keeping. But I was wrong. There is nothing to keep, nothing to guard. The flame is gone. The nation is gone. Perhaps it was always an illusion. Perhaps Okran himself would tell us we missed the point entirely, that we built a monument when he only ever lit a candle. I am leaving this note, and then I am leaving this place. I don't know where I'll go. Somewhere the light hasn't failed, if such a place exists. Somewhere new. May whoever reads this find what I could not. Keeper Senna. Elias read the note 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it back on the pedestal beneath the cracked glass dome. Senna. He remembered that name. A brilliant young scholar, decades younger than himself. She had written papers on the early texts, had questioned certain interpretations. I had heard she fell out of favor with the council for asking uncomfortable questions. And she had been here at the end, had watched the flame die, had been the last to leave, the last until him. He stood in the empty temple as the afternoon light slanted through the broken windows, painting colored patterns on the dusty floor. He thought he should feel something. Grief, perhaps. Anger. Despair. Something appropriate to the moment, to standing in the ruins of everything his life had been built upon. But he felt only a strange, detached calm, an acceptance. This was how things ended, not with dramatic confrontations or apocalyptic violence, but with a candle going out, and people slowly walking away, and silence filling the spaces where voices used to echo. He left the temple as the sun was setting, stood in the plaza and watched the sky turn orange, then pink, then purple, watched the first stars emerge, remembered standing in this exact spot 40 years ago, when the temple had been alive with light and prayer, when he had believed he was part of something eternal. That night, Elias slept in one of the priest quarters near the temple, a small room with a narrow bed and a window that looked toward the mountains. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the silence, feeling the vast emptiness of the city around him. In the morning, he would begin his walk back, away from Ember, away from the holy nation, toward whatever came next, whatever world existed beyond the borders of this faded dream. But tonight, in this last moment, he allowed himself to remember it as it had been, allowed himself to hold in his mind the image of the city alive, the temples burning bright, the people gathered in faith and community and hope. It was real once. That was enough. Let go now, release what's faded, drift into darkness, soft as velvet. Your journey ends as all journeys must. Settle now into stillness. Elias left Ember as the sun rose, painting the ruined city in shades of gold and rose. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him now but memory, and memory he could carry without needing to see. His feet found the broken pilgrim road, and he walked. The morning was cool. Birds sang somewhere in the distance. The world continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the rise and fall of nations, to the lighting and extinguishing of flames, to the hopes of creatures who believed themselves significant.
And in that indifference, Elias found a strange comfort. He thought about the note, Keeper Senna's final words left in the empty temple. Perhaps Okran himself would tell us we missed the point entirely, that we built a monument when he only ever lit a candle. A candle, just a candle, small, temporary, meant to burn for a while and then go out, making way for other candles, other lights, other ways of seeing in the darkness. The holy nation had tried to make Okran's candle eternal, had built glass cases and vast temples and entire systems of doctrine around the idea that this one light must never, could never, would never fail. And in doing so, they had created something brittle, something that could not adapt or change or evolve, something that, when the flame finally did go out, left nothing but darkness and confusion in its wake. But what if, Elias wondered, that was never the point? What if Okran had been teaching something simpler all along? That light is something you make, not something you worship. That faith is not about holding on to certainty, but about being willing to light new candles in the dark, even when you don't know if they'll last, even when you're afraid they won't. What if the fall of the holy nation was not a tragedy, but a transformation? The necessary ending of one thing so that other things could begin. He walked for days, weeks. Time blurred in the rhythm of footsteps and breath. He passed through villages that were finding their own ways now, building their own communities without the structure or authority of the nation that had abandoned them. He saw people working together, helping each other, creating small lights that might not burn forever, but burned bright enough for now.
He saw children playing, heard laughter, watched a woman tending a garden with patient care, watched a man teaching his daughter to carve wood, watched strangers sharing a meal by the roadside, offering him a place at their fire without asking who he was or where he had come from. Small lights, countless small lights, not organized into any grand design, not part of any eternal plan, just existing, burning for a while, bringing warmth to those nearby, then fading as all lights fade, making room for new flames. And Elias understood, finally, what Okran might have known from the beginning, that this was enough, that this had always been enough, that humans did not need eternal nations or infallible doctrines or flames that never went out. They only needed the willingness to keep lighting candles, to keep finding ways to make light in darkness, to keep gathering around fires and sharing stories and being kind to one another in the brief time they had. The holy nation fell, but the people persisted, changed certainly, diminished in some ways, freed in others, but persisting, as life always persists, as light always returns in new forms, through new means, carried by new hands. One evening, Elias came to a small village he did not recognize. It had not been there 40 years ago, or if it had been too insignificant to note. A dozen buildings clustered around a central square. Gardens, a well, simple and functional and alive. The people greeted him kindly, offered him food and shelter, asked nothing in return except perhaps a story if he had one to tell. So that night, sitting around a fire in the village square, with the stars beginning to emerge overhead and the smell of cooking in the air, and children drowsing against their parents' shoulders, Elias told them a story. Not about the holy nation's glory, not about its power or its certainty or its vast temples and elaborate ceremonies, but about the beginning. About a wanderer with a candle who stopped in villages and sat with people and told stories. About how he never claimed to have all the answers, only better questions. About how he taught that every person carries their own light, waiting to be kindled, waiting to be shared. About how the point was never the candle itself, but what the candle represented. The willingness to bring light, the courage to sit with others in the darkness, the understanding that we are all walking through shadows, and the best we can do is walk together, sharing what small lights we have. The villagers listened. Some nodded, some smiled. When he finished, a woman said quietly, "That's a good story." "Yes," Elias agreed. "Yes, it is." He stayed in that village for a time, days turning to weeks, turning to months. He helped where he could, taught the children to read, worked in the gardens, sat with the elderly and listened to their memories. In the evenings, he would sometimes tell more stories, not always about Okran, sometimes just stories about his own life, his own struggles and failures and small victories. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand that this was what the end looked like. Not dramatic, not tragic, just different. The holy nation was gone, but life continued. Changed form like water becoming vapor, becoming rain, becoming water again. Nothing lost, really, only transformed. One evening, sitting alone by the fire after the others had gone to bed, Elias lit a candle. A simple tallow candle, the kind the villagers made themselves. Nothing special, nothing eternal. He watched it burn, watched the flame dance and flicker in the night breeze, watched the wax slowly melt, feeding the fire that gave the light. And he thought, this is enough. This has always been enough. The candle would burn for a few hours, then it would go out, and tomorrow someone would like another, and the next day another still, an endless succession of small flames, each temporary, each precious, each sufficient unto its moment. The holy nation had tried to hold on to one flame forever, but forever was never the point. The point was the lighting, the tending, the sharing, the willingness to begin again and again and again in an endless cycle of light and dark and light renewed. Elias was old now. He could feel it in his bones, in the way his breath came shorter, in the increasing heaviness of sleep. He did not have much time left, perhaps a few years, perhaps only months. But he was not afraid.
not anymore. Because he understood now that ending was not failure, that falling was not defeat, that the extinguishing of one light simply made room for others to burn. The holy nation fell. Okran's eternal flame went out. The temples emptied and the priests scattered, and the grand certainties dissolved into questions and doubt and silence. And in that falling, in that ending, something was released. Something that had been trapped inside the rigid structures of doctrine and hierarchy and the desperate attempt to make things last forever. The simple truth that Okran had been trying to teach all along. That light is not something you hold, it's something you share, something you pass along, something you trust others to carry when your hands grow too tired, when your flame grows too dim, when your time comes to rest. The holy nation fell, but the light goes on. In different hands, in different forms, in the countless small ways that humans bring warmth to darkness, that they gather together against the night, that they tell stories and share fires and help each other through the shadows. The nation fell, but the people endure. And that, perhaps, was always the point. Breathe now, deeply, slowly. Feel yourself sinking into softness, into rest. The story is ending, but endings are not sad. They are only transitions from light to darkness to light again. The holy nation sleeps now beneath the dust of years, its temples quiet, its roads empty, its grand certainties faded into doubt. But somewhere, a candle is being lit. Somewhere, people gather around a fire. Somewhere, a story is being told. And in these small acts, these tiny lights, these moments of warmth, Okran's true teaching endures. Not in monuments, but in memory. Not in doctrine, but in deeds. Not in eternity, but in the present moment. This moment, this breath, this gentle darkness that holds you now. Rest, traveler. Your pilgrimage is complete. You have walked through ruins and memory, through rise and fall and rise again. You have seen how light is made and lost and made anew. And now you can rest in the knowledge that all things pass, that all lights fade, that all nations fall, and that this is not tragedy, but transformation, the natural rhythm of a world that never stops changing. Sleep now, deeply, peacefully. Let the ruins fade from your mind. Let the stories settle into dreams. Let yourself drift like a candle flame in the wind, flickering, dancing, beautiful. And when you wake in the morning light, remember this, that you carry your own flame, small perhaps, temporary certainly, but yours, to tend, to share, to pass along, until the time comes to rest and let others carry the light forward into tomorrow. Good night, pilgrim. Good night, seeker. good night. The holy nation has fallen, but you are here, safe, warm, at peace, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep now, sleep. In darkness soft as prayer, in silence deep as faith, in the gentle certainty that morning will come, with new light and new stories and new candles to light. But for now, only sleep, only dreams, only the quiet end of all things that makes room for beginnings. Good night, good night, good night. The holy nation has fallen, but you are here, safe, warm, at peace, and that is enough. That has always been enough. Sleep